My name is Eric Gaskell, and you're listening to the Distorted History Podcast.
To speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
I can give you merry tales and joyous laughter.
Shameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror.
A long struggle for freedom.
It really is a revolution.
Welcome back to this kind of odd two-part series on the band Tool and the creation of my favorite album of theirs, Lateralus, which, as I argued last time, is intrinsically tied to the creation of their album Anima and the debut album of Maynard James Keenan's side project A Perfect Circle. Now, Tool had emerged in the early 90s amidst a changing music scene. Hair metal was dying and was being replaced by the so-called grunge scene, which consisted of a fairly diverse group of bands already. Meanwhile, also emerging around this time in the vacuum that had been left by hair metal, as labels were searching for the next big thing, were a number of other bands that were fairly unique and not easily categorized. Groups like Jane's Addiction, Nine Inch Nails, Faith No More, and Rage Against the Machine, to name a few, all came out and started rising to prominence around the same time. As for Tool's specific journey, I traced that out in the previous episode up until the recording and release of their second full-length album, Anima, an album that would debut at number 2 on the Billboard charts and would see the group earning a Grammy for Best Metal Performance for the album's title track. It was also, for our tale today, the album that saw the first appearance of bassist Justin Chancellor, who was replacing original bass player Paul D'Amore, who had been fired over creative differences. With the success of Anima, an album that saw a shift in creative direction for the band, you would think everything would be smooth sailing for Tool, yet the complete opposite was the case. However, before I get into the troubled waters the band were about to sail into, first, like always, I want to acknowledge the myriad of sources that I used, which includes articles by writers like George Garner, John Widerhorn, Eleanor Goodman, Sarah Jensen, Maynard James Keenan, John McCallie, Kurt Loder, Aaron Burgess, Ryan Reed, Daniel J. Kushner, Liberty Dunworth, Jordan Blum, Andrew McMillan, Phil Freeman, Dan Oliva, Andy Green, Brad Keefe, James Roberts, Sam Law, BJ Lisco, Chris Norris, Hank Stemmer, Brad Angle, Graham Hartman, as well as interviews by Rick Beto and Joel Martin on their respective YouTube channels, links to all of which will be available on this podcast Ko-fi and Twitter pages. And with all that being said, let's begin. Anima was such a massive hit that Tool ended up touring extensively in support of it, which on one hand was good as it meant that people were responding to their music and wanted to come hear them perform it live. On the flip side, however, this meant that the members of Tool were all living in fairly close quarters for an extended period of time, which meant by the end of the tour they really needed some time apart from one another. Further complicating matters, though, the label the band had originally signed with would be purchased and absorbed by Volcano Entertainment in 1996, with Zoo's purchase allegedly being largely due to them holding the rights to Tool, which you would think would lead to a good relationship between the band and its label. At the very least, you would think there would be good communication between the label and the band they had bought another label just to acquire. Yet in April 1997, the members of Tool were under the impression that Volcano did not exercise its option to renew their deal, as they had not presented the band with written confirmation of such a move. As a result of this situation, the band started pursuing opportunities with other labels. Meanwhile, Volcano did not believe they needed to make such an official communication with the band. From the label's perspective, all they had to do was continue on as they always had, and the extension of the deal would be implied. As such, they weren't exactly happy when they learned the band was pursuing negotiations with other labels, and so they looked to put a stop to any and all such communications. Tool then filed a lawsuit against Volcano based upon their belief that the label had not exercised its option to renew their deal, and thus could not stand in their way in seeking a new contract with a different label, to which Volcano responded by filing a lawsuit against the band. This was apparently an incredibly stressful time for the group, so much so that they found it difficult to concentrate on writing music with this issue hanging over their heads. Now, this would eventually be resolved out of court in the year 2000 as the band agreed to a 3-album extension with Volcano. In the meantime, though, they were having trouble writing their next album regardless of which label was going to release it. Indeed, according to Maynard, quote, "All the litigation and stuff was just crippling. which was particularly hard on him as he seems to constantly need to be doing something, and until the others actually had songs completed, he was unable to do anything, leading the lyricist and singer to proclaim, quote, "I just had to go do something." Something that would take the form of a project that his roommate and Tool guitar tech Billy Howardell was working on. Billy had worked as a guitar tech for bands like David Bowie, Faith No More, 9 Inch Nails, Guns N' Roses, and of course Tool over the years. As such, he would have been responsible for the care, maintenance, and repair of various guitars and equipment for these groups, and would have been a part of many a tour. Yet the moment that likely gave Howardell the confidence that he could really make a go at this whole professional musician thing occurred during 9 Inch Nails' Downward Spiral tour. You see, there was a moment during that show where a screen would come down between the band and the audience. During this brief break in the show, Billy and the other techs for the band would then use this opportunity to clean up the stage a bit before the start of the next song. Now, this break in the start of the next song was very specifically timed. Indeed, there was a timer off stage counting down to when the band was to start playing Eraser, which was especially notable one night as Trent Reznor, as a part of whatever he was doing prior to the curtain falling, had managed to knock the wind out of himself. So as Billy and the others were rushing about cleaning up the stage as much as they could, Trent was laying there trying to recover. Now, Billy would inform him that time was running out, but as the timer hit 10 seconds, Reznor was still showing no signs of getting up. So after trying again to get him to move, Howardell tried a different tact, asking Trent if he wanted him to play the next song, and Trent indicated that he did. So there Billy was, having only played in front of people 3 times in his life, suddenly thrust into playing in front of a sold-out arena of 15,000 people. Howardell, though, managed to handle the situation well. So well, in fact, that Reznor suggested that they do the same thing the next 2 weeks of the show. As for how Billy had first met the members of Tool and Maynard in particular, they had known each other since 1992, when Tool opened for Fishbone, the band that Howardell was working for as guitar tech at the time. They apparently hit it off, as not only would Billy end up working as Adam Jones' guitar tech, but he even became Maynard's roommate in the North Hollywood home he was renting. The members of Tool were apparently aware of Billy's efforts to write his own music, as Adam Jones would be responsible for bassist Paz Lanchantine joining the group. Paz is a bassist and violinist whose parents were both classically trained musicians from Argentina who had moved to LA when Paz was just 4 years old. Young Paz's first instrument was the piano, which she learned from her mother, and from there she next learned how to play the violin. All of which was done with her parents' approval, although the same could not be said for her next instrument, the electric bass, which she first started secretly playing at age 13 in her closet after her parents went to bed. In doing so, she was heavily influenced by the likes of Paul McCartney and John Paul Jones of Led Zeppelin. Paz would also be heavily influenced by the Pixies, a group she would eventually later in life join and tour with. Before that would happen, though, Paz went to school for film. Indeed, it was actually through her work in the film industry that she ended up with The Perfect Circle. You see, Paz would work on music videos for Tool, which meant she was working alongside Tool guitarist Adam Jones, who was responsible for directing all of their videos. It was during this time together that Adam learned Paz played bass. Indeed, she had done quite a lot of session work and had been a part of a group called Cherry Llama, where she had played bass and violin. Cherry Llama, however, would never really do anything, as they couldn't find a lead vocalist, and so the band just kind of faded away. Jones, however, upon finding out about all of this, mentioned to Paz that his guitar tech Billy Howardell was working on some music of his own, and suggested they try working together on it. It was thanks to Adam then that Billy and Paz met, with the two hitting it off, becoming best friends, and working on music together. Notably, they were working on this music together in the house that Billy was staying in with Maynard, who, as I've noted, was growing really bored while the rest of the members of Tool were trying to write their next album, all the while being distracted by the ongoing Volcano lawsuit. Eventually it got to the point that one day as Paz and Billy were working on some music together, according to Paz, Maynard poked his head into the room and asked if he could be in their band. Now initially Howardell had envisioned his music being accompanied by a female vocalist. However, the prospect of having Maynard James Keenan of Tool being the singer of his band was too great of an opportunity to pass up, if for no other reason than the attention his presence in the band was sure to draw. Meanwhile, for his part, Maynard would praise Howardell for not being afraid to throw ideas out to get his reaction, be it good or bad, as well as being receptive to the tweaks or other changes that the singer felt needed to be made. Maynard also felt that Billy was really good at coming up with melodies for the songs, even if Maynard felt he hid said melodies under a bunch of other stuff that the vocalist would strip away when first being presented with the music to get to that melodic core. Also joining this growing band of misfits was guitarist Troy Van Leeuwen of Failure and later of Queens of the Stone Age, who would also be joined by Primus drummer Tim Alexander, who played with the group for some of their early live shows before they recorded the album. He wouldn't stick around much after that, however, as he would only play on the first track of The Hollow before departing and being replaced by session drummer John Freese. Now, on paper then, this seemed like a bit of a supergroup of sorts, but in reality, it was kind of a one-man show with Maynard providing the vocals. You see, especially for this first album, Billy wrote and recorded much of the music himself. In fact, he was even in charge of engineering and producing the album as he was basically funding it himself. As a result, he recorded most of the music other than the drums in a little pottery room off the detached garage in the house that he and Maynard were renting. He even had to do the soundproofing of the room himself. Howardell then provided the vast majority of the guitar parts on the album, with Van Leeuwen only playing on 2 songs. Paz, meanwhile, was a bit more involved as she provided backing vocals throughout and contributed violin parts on 3 tracks, notably being joined in doing so by her brother Luciano on viola for 3 libras. That being said, when it came to playing bass, Howardell again provided all the bass tracks except on one of the songs, which was a bit of a rough situation for Paz as she felt that it was important that if she was performing these songs on stage, that it should be reflected on the record. Granted, though, she understood this was Howardell's baby, but that didn't mean it wasn't disappointing. Still, she kept that disappointment to herself because on some level it was an honor just to be a part of such a project. Paz, however, recognized that she needed more, so when it came time for Maynard to return to work with Tool, she also started thinking it would be best for her to leave. In doing so, she would join Billy Corgan's startup supergroup Zwan, which may not have been the greatest choice, as from her own recounting of events, Corgan doesn't sound like the best person to work with, something that Paz was warned about by multiple people, including former Smashing Pumpkins guitarist James Iha, who was joining A Perfect Circle round about the same time as she was leaving, as Corgan has been characterized as a dictator when it came to the band and seemingly not all that compassionate. As you see, when he decided to break up the band, he didn't tell anyone else in the group. Instead, he went straight to the press. In doing so, he took shots at the other members of Zwan, including apparently shots at Paz's family, which he did at a point in time when he knew that her brother had just committed suicide and she was having to deal with all of that. Back to the subject of A Perfect Circle, though, for Maynard, the music was a bit more personal than what he typically presented with Tool, or at the very least it was more obviously personal in nature, as there were some definitely personal tracks on Anima, with H being about his son and his struggles to be a father despite his own less than ideal childhood, and Jimmy, which I talked about last time, that dealt with his mother being paralyzed when he was 11. Additionally, there would also be songs of a personal nature on upcoming Tool releases, the most notable of which being Wings for Marie and 10,000 Days, as they dealt with his mother's death 10,000 days after she was first paralyzed. Despite these examples, Maynard in general would describe Tool as being more left-brained and masculine, while considering A Perfect Circle to be more right-brained and feminine. Indeed, the very nature of the album makes it a more personal piece of art, as Maynard noms is French for Sea of Names. As such, the track list primarily consists of just that, names of individuals that Billy and Maynard knew, or the mythical titles and or themes they attached to individuals that they knew. At the very least, Maynard saw in A Perfect Circle a new way to express his emotions, as you have explicitly personal tracks like Judith, in which he rages against his mother's illness and her continued faith despite said illness. Branna, meanwhile, is just a straight-up love song directed towards the woman he was with, who was also the mother of his son. I think they were married at some point, but I can't really find out when that was and when they split, but in the end that doesn't really matter. All that matters is they were together in some form or fashion when he wrote the song about/for her. Who the other songs were about, meanwhile, is unclear. Thomas and Rose, for example, could be seen as being about Maynard himself, with Thomas being a reference to Doubting Thomas and the singer's issues with religion, while Rose could be about him standing up for himself in some kind of abusive or repressive relationship, or alternatively, they could be about other individuals who fit those descriptions. In addition to trying to write more personal and emotionally expressive songs, Maynard also approached his vocal delivery differently than he had with his work in Tool, noting that, quote, I think people who listen to Perfect Circle hear something totally different from me. It's much more like The Cure. It's more ethereal and accessible. Also, I think a lot of Tool fans weren't aware that I could sing. For Paz, she was of the opinion that there was more of a sensitivity to Maynard's vocals in A Perfect Circle than what he had displayed in Tool up until that point. Paz then believes this was Maynard really embracing his influences, many of whom are female singers like Tori Amos, which, whether consciously or not, fit with Howardell's initial intentions of having a female vocalist. As for the overall sound of the album, Paz would characterize A Perfect Circle as, quote, almost like the pop version of Tool. It's anima confined to 3 minutes in some ways. Indeed, the music is somewhat simple compared to your typical Tool release, but at the same time it hides its complexities, as it plays around with dissonance like on the aforementioned Rose, and with what are unconventional instruments for your standard rock band, as it features violins and violas throughout thanks to Paz. It even features a gourd kalimba, an African percussion instrument, and a piano for the album closer Over. Meanwhile, writer Liberty Dunworth of Guitar.com would call the album, quote, rife with contradictions, morbidly beautiful, and technically emotive, ultimately calling it a, quote, uncertain hybrid of Tool, Jane's Addiction, and Killing Joke. For Howardell, the most critical or important track off this first album is Orestes, as he considers it to be the band's overture, in that it informs the listener about who the band was and what they sounded like. A song that he was also particularly proud of because it was the one song that his father really complimented him on before his death in 2000. Now, 3 Libras was originally planned to be the album's first single, or that was the plan until Rob Halford of Judas Priest heard the album and set about convincing the group they were making a mistake. For the veteran vocalist, even though 3 Libras was a good song and would be a good single, in his opinion to make the most impact right off the bat, their first single had to be the more aggressive and in-your-face Judith. That song, in his opinion, was the one that would catch everyone's attention, as he predicted if they went with Judith, they would sell 1 million copies of the album. And they eventually would. Indeed, the attention the band gained due to its first single led to 188,000 copies of Mare de Noms being sold in its first week. An impressive number in its own right, as the album debuted at the number 4 spot on the Billboard chart. Making it even more impressive was this was the band's debut album. In fact, this was the highest ever appearance on the Billboard charts for a rock band's debut release. Notably, prior to the album's release, A Perfect Circle would open the first Coachella in 1999, with Maynard actually bookending the event, as after opening with A Perfect Circle, he also closed the show with Tool, which was confusing for some fans who were unaware of what was going on behind the scenes. Indeed, the public perception of fans who knew nothing about the ongoing legal quagmire Tool were stuck in saw A Perfect Circle as Maynard abandoning Tool, which wasn't true, but that doesn't mean there weren't some issues going on within the band as a result of the choice to run off and pursue this other project. Justin Chancellor, for example, from his interviews, seems to suggest that the rest of Tool initially wanted Maynard to hold off on A Perfect Circle until after they finished working on their own album. For Maynard, though, this didn't make any sense, as they hadn't gotten the music to the point where he could get involved. For the singer, it just seemed logical that he would go and do his thing, and by the time he was done with A Perfect Circle, they would have the music for the next album sorted out to the point that he would be needed. Which brings us to Tool's writing process, which is very collaborative in nature. Everyone is free to bring in ideas, add their parts, and offer their opinions and suggestions as they work through ideas. Indeed, Danny Carey would state that the band works because they are, quote, a pretty good filter for each other. We find what works for us individually, and then we know what the band's identity is and what we do. Notably, though, their writing process sounds like it's a bit different than other bands where people bring in riffs or song ideas, and they play around with those ideas and jam and see what comes out of it. For example, Adam Jones would characterize Tool's process, quote, instead of just jamming riffs, there's a lot more thought behind it. There are weird concepts, there are inside jokes. We love this journey we're all on, the complex things of life, the simple things of life, talking and bullshitting in the rehearsal space. These concepts come up in a very intellectual way, almost like in a classroom, and then we apply them to the music. For Justin Chancellor in particular, his primary memories of this time is fighting with each other, struggling over parts, and finally coming to a solution, calling this whole experience a, quote, very emotional roller coaster. As, in addition to all the stress resulting from the lawsuit, this was also his first real opportunity to influence his Tool music and direction, whether he wanted to or not. As, like I covered last time with Anima, he was consciously not trying to change the band. He was a fan and respected what they had been up until that point, and he didn't feel comfortable coming in and changing them or their sound. Plus, with Anima, 4 songs were already pretty much written by the time Paul was fired and he was brought in, so Justin was kind of just adding his own ideas to ones that already existed. Now, though, he was in the position of having to write an entire album from scratch. Being involved in writing a Tool album from the ground floor was a new experience for the bassist. In doing so, despite his own self-doubts and reluctance to really alter what Tool were and had been, the others were actively encouraging him to lend his voice to the band. Indeed, they were more than willing to change and become something different as a result of having this new voice in the group. For this, Justin was grateful for how open-minded they were. Indeed, it sounds like occasionally Chancellor would play things without thinking, things that he never intended to bring into the band, possibly because he felt like they would not fit or whatever. Yet before he could distract Adam and Danny with something else, they would latch onto what he had unconsciously played and insist that's what they were working on now. This is not just Justin saying this either, as Jones has also characterized their process as being very open, accepting, and democratic. The core idea being that they would listen to the ideas that the others brought in, and regardless of whether or not they connected with them at first, they would still play around with them to see what, if anything, was there. For Lateralus then, Jones, Chancellor, and Carey had a routine, where they would meet in the rehearsal space, apparently the same loft where they had first formed the band, every Monday to Thursday to work on ideas. It was during this time where they would share ideas, concepts, riffs, whatever they had come up with, and they would give each one a fair listening and exploration of what they could do with it. Sessions that they would record without fail. They would then pick out the best parts they had come up with and put them on a CD that they would take home to listen to and work with. They would then come in the following day to see what new ideas everyone had come up with, whether new or based off of stuff they had played around with previously, and start messing around and incorporating them. As they were doing this, in some ways they were building off the final track of Anima, Third Eye, which was also the last track they had written as a band. It was, at the time, the most experimental thing they had done, and they now wanted to explore from that starting point. Indeed, with Keenan off doing a perfect circle, the rest of the band felt free to really experiment as much as their hearts desired. For example, while they had explored odd measures and polyrhythms a bit previously, they now really started leaning into those kinds of ideas. Chancellor, though, insists that this really wasn't some conscious attempt to be clever. While a lot of digital ink has been spilled over the years about the time signatures present on this album and the deeper meaning present in them, it does not seem to have been that much of a conscious effort on Tool's part, as according to Chancellor, quote, "To me that's really accidental. That's just me fighting with them about time signatures and rhythms. Most often then, they're not necessarily trying to be clever, it's just how they approach the music. As Chancellor would state, quote, "It's really just a way things come out. From my point of view, I have a lot of rhythms come into my head. I'm walking my dogs or something and I get these chugging rhythms in my head. I count them out and they tend to not be in rounds of 4. There's something I like about the awkwardness or intensity of something not quite resolving or over-resolving. I love 5 because it keeps snapping back. It's got this weird urgency or uncomfortability like, where is it going?" Chancellor's natural inclinations toward these unusual time signatures fit in with what the band was already doing. Although, as you might have guessed by how long it takes Tool to write an album, it's not so simple as bringing an idea into the group and that instantly becoming the basis for a song. Instead, they have to take every idea apart, dissecting it, before building it back up again. For Chancellor, this often takes the form of bringing in an idea with a weird time signature, to which the others will react by wanting to first see what the idea sounds like being played in a simple 4/4 time, with the idea being they already know what it sounds like in this odd time signature, and so they can always go back to that initial way of doing it, but why not play around with it first to see what, if anything else, is there, and if maybe it sounds better being played another way. To do this, they benefit from their different approaches. Jones, for example, would characterize how he works as starting with something simple and gradually figuring out how to make it more complex, while he feels the others start with something complex and then gradually work to make it simpler. For Lateralus in particular, they would take these really complex ideas and strip them down so they could start turning them into a song. Then, once they had that structure down as a foundation, they began adding the complexities back in, seeing what still fit and what didn't. In doing all this, Danny, Adam, and Justin were pushing the boundaries of not just typical mainstream hard rock or metal, but even what they themselves had done in the past. Something which made Justin Chancellor in particular nervous. He was the new guy and he was bringing in stuff that he, as a fan of Tool, knew was different. Indeed, since he had started out as a fan, he could say with confidence that the stuff they were coming up with didn't really sound like Tool had in the past, and he was afraid they might alienate their own fans with what they were doing. As such, he wanted to make extra sure that his bandmates who had been a part of the group from the beginning were truly comfortable with what he was bringing in, and the shape the music was taking as a result. Danny and Adam, though, were both apparently really into the new material. So as much as Justin felt obligated to try and stay true to the old Tool sound, the others were fully on board with doing something different. And Lateralus would be different, as when the album came out I wasn't all that familiar with the group at the time. So when one of my friends got the album I asked him how it was, and his response was, "It's like Tool, but different." Which at the time for someone who, again, wasn't really familiar with the band wasn't helpful at all. Now though, after getting not just Lateralus but all of their albums for myself, I can say it is a pretty apt description. As a result, I feel it's fair to say that if Anima kinda sees Danny Carey and his drum work getting showcased, then Lateralus, even though Danny Carey and Adam Jones continue to display their own brilliance, is really about Justin Chancellor, who by this point has started to find his feet within the band. Indeed, his bass parts feel like they drive the song, as his riffs almost occupy the same place guitar riffs would occupy in other more traditional bands. Now, so far I've discussed how Adam, Danny, and Justin come up with and assemble the instrumental music for Tool, which is where Maynard comes in, as it's only when the music for a song is fully done that he starts writing the lyrics and melody to accompany it. Indeed, there had been times leading up to this point where Maynard got frustrated and annoyed when he started writing lyrics to a piece only to have the others change it on him. As a result, he requested they only give him something if they were finished with it. This was likely because he had to put in a fair amount of work to figure out where his lyrics fit in within the music, only to have the underlying structure change. Plus, according to Justin Chancellor, Maynard's approach is very much tied to his initial response to the music, or at least his initial response after listening to it over and over again, as it's at that point that he comes up with a word or idea that becomes the core of what he's going to write, and he very rarely goes back on that initial kind of gut response that he feels is the most honest. Which is not to say they couldn't change anything after they had given it to Maynard. It's just that any changes they would make at that point would typically be tweaks that he requested that they would try and accommodate. Like if he wanted a section repeated for another verse or chorus, or a section extended to accommodate his lyrical vision. To be clear, writing lyrics, especially for a Tool song, isn't as easy as just writing some words down, as he's gotta marry his words to a melody that also works with the weird and or shifting time signatures present in their music. According to Maynard, the first step in this process involves just listening to the instrumental track over and over again to get a feel for it, at which point he lays down a simple vocal track in which he focuses more on timing and melody than words. It's only at that point, as he starts counting out syllables and beats, that he starts thinking about words, as he finds a kind of core line from which he can build the rest of the song off of. A very complex and demanding task that always leaves the other members of the band impressed by what he comes up with. Justin Chancellor, for example, has stated, quote, "The music's very complex, but to have Maynard go, 'Alright, that's fine,' and listen to it studiously and fit words, thoughts, and emotions to the scaffold of it is wonderful. It brings the emotion out of the music because without that, the overcomplicated rhythm section or the prog rockiness of it is a little unemotional." Now, the other members of Tool only had like 3 songs done to the point they could give them to Maynard before he went on tour with A Perfect Circle. Then, as he went on tour, he initially did some work listening to the tracks in the back of the tour bus before eventually realizing that it was too much and not a good environment to try and get such work done in. As a result, he asked the others not to send him any more music until he was done touring, at which point, feeling that they suddenly had much more time, the others figured they might as well take their time working on the rest, really experimenting and making sure everything was perfect. Once all was said and done, it was time to finally head back into the studio and start recording, a process that would start in October of 2000 and run through January 2001. As a result of this extended timeline, the recording of Lateralus took place in multiple studios, mainly due to time and scheduling constraints. Plus, they only needed a studio with a big room when they were recording Danny Carey's drum parts. As such, they didn't need to spend the kind of money to rent such a space when they were working on the other parts. Yet, for as good and cohesive of an album as Lateralus would prove to be, it had a bit of a rocky start. As on their first day in the studio, producer David Bottrill, who had previously worked with the band on Anima, occupied himself getting all the equipment set up so it was ready for the band when they got in there. However, as time passed, he could not help but wonder where they were. He, after all, knew they were in the building. While he had seen them heading into the studio's lounge area, none of them had made it into the studio proper to get to work. So, after some time, Bottrell sent someone to see what was up, at which point he discovered the band was having a bit of an animated discussion. Indeed, according to Justin Chancellor, quote, "We spent the first day in the lounge having it out with each other, kicking and screaming, laughing and crying. That whole day we didn't go into the tracking room at all." Apparently, the whole group hadn't really been in one room together for some time. Granted, they had a couple of sessions together as they worked on the songs before heading in, but for the most part, Maynard had not been with them during that time, which is probably why things came to a head the way they did that day. Basically, it seems as if all the issues they had with one another over the last couple of years, ever since the recording of Anima, just finally came out that day. Stuff like them spending too much time together on the Anima tour, at which point they got on each other's nerves, the stress and exhaustion stemming from their legal case, and even seemingly Maynard's absence due to a perfect circle, all just suddenly boiled over. Adam Jones characterized the situation like a fight between brothers, quote, "That little thing you hate about your brother, you really hate the 12th time it happens. I think a lot of things bubbled up." Chancellor, meanwhile, would characterize what happened as a, quote, "pulled apart a little bit because we forgot the journey we were on, where we were trying to go, and why we were doing it in the first place. It was a bit of a moment where the friendships and stuff came into a little bit of jeopardy because everyone got a bit too burned out." To be clear, though, as Jones would specify, quote, "We're not throwing punches at each other, but we all have our opinions. We're brothers and sometimes it's really hard to communicate." Everything then just kind of boiled over on that first day, to the point that they got nothing else done. Indeed, they were all left so exhausted by the whole thing, they basically just agreed to come back and try again tomorrow. Before doing so, producer David Bottrell wanted to make sure he wasn't wasting his time, and so he asked them if they were sure they were actually going to make this album, and they all agreed they were. Indeed, Chancellor would characterize that first day as ultimately a good thing, as by putting everything out there they were able to have a clean slate going forward to work from, with Adam Jones stating, quote, "It was such a thing that needed to happen, and it happened and made everything else better." They then compared that big blow-up that first day to popping a big zit, as once they got all that negativity out, they started to heal. Part of the issue was figuring out the way each other works, like for example Maynard not being able to handle writing lyrics to music and the others were continuing to alter and change said music, so they learned to only really loop him in when they were confidently finished writing their part. They also came to accept and even see outside projects like A Perfect Circle as a good thing. Sure, it added some additional complications like figuring out when the other band was releasing their album and going on tour so they could schedule around it, but Jones, for example, has come to see Maynard's outside projects as necessary outlets. This having all their issues come to the fore in one moment and then moving on and healing afterwards was strangely appropriate for the theme of the album that Maynard had introduced through his lyrics, as he would call Lateralus a, quote, "soundtrack for healing." Notably, the first track on the album, The Grudge, is about letting go of old grudges and negativity, no matter how integral they have become to your life so you can grow and heal, with Maynard as the main character of the song seemingly letting go of all that anger, the grudge, with one final primal scream, which is another rabbit hole I found out before deciding to make these episodes, as there are multiple videos of professional vocal coaches and opera singers having their minds blown as Maynard's scream just keeps going, and going, and going, and going. As for the repeated references to Saturn throughout the song, they are related to the theory that every 28 years, Saturn returns to the place it had been in the moment when someone was born. It's at this point then, according to Maynard, that, quote, "You either let go of past illusions and ascend to the next level, or you sink like a stone. If you can't make it past your Saturn return, you remain stagnant." The next major track on the album, The Patient, is also seemingly about healing, as it sees Maynard revisiting his mother Judith Marie and her paralysis, a topic he had touched upon previously with Tool on their last album Anima with the song Jimmy, in which he focused on the impact it had on him at age 11 and then trying to come to terms with it as an adult. He then famously revisited the same topic with A Perfect Circle and Judith, a song in which he raged against his mother's unshakable faith even though she had done nothing to deserve her fate. And he would also notably mourn her eventual passing on Tool's next album 10,000 Days. For the patient, though, Maynard seems to be writing more from her perspective and the way that she feels going through all of this. The patient then is a reference to both her being a medical patient and her patience in dealing with being paralyzed. The core of the song, though, seems to focus on her decision to keep carrying on, both because of her faith and I believe for her son, as I think it's his own loving embrace that Maynard is referencing here. As such, to me, the patient almost feels like a response of sorts to A Perfect Circle's Judith. Maynard had let all his rage out in that song, and this song is possibly a result of him. Maynard had let all his rage out in that song, and this song is possibly a result of him and his mother speaking about it, and him coming to see things more from her perspective. From there we move on to the first Tool song that I remember hearing, and the one that made me want to buy this album in the first place, Schism. A song about the importance of communication between people in a relationship, and how it's the only way to heal things when they start to fall apart. A song which also really illustrates a lot of things about Tool. As for one, it's Justin Chancellor on bass who is playing what is essentially the core main riff that drives the song, with Adam Jones occasionally mirroring and playing off of it. Then when it came to writing the song, their real breakthrough moment, the moment when it really became a Tool song, came when they hit upon that middle bit where the song deviates from that main riff it had been built off of up until that point. For guitarist Adam Jones, moments like that are important because it always comes down to, quote, "Do you want to write a 3-minute song, or do you want to write a 7-minute song that has another feel in it? We do this verse, chorus, and a lot of times we'll do some kind of jam. Then it just needs to take a breath. That middle riff, it's almost like giving birth to something and watching it grow again to the end. We like to play. We don't want to stop. That's the curse of Tool." Which is not to say they have ever approached a song with a predetermined length in mind. As far as they are concerned, the song will be as long as it needs to be. Ultimately, it's just about what feels right to them. Now, as I previously alluded, Schism would be the song chosen to be the album's first single. Notably, Adam and Danny both identified the song as a potential hit pretty much right away, but Justin Chancellor wasn't so sure. He felt it might be a bit too odd, and yet despite his misgivings, Schism went to number 2 on the Billboard charts, and even won a Grammy for Best Metal Performance over the likes of Slayer, Slipknot, and System of a Down. Schism is then followed by a pair of linked tracks, Parable and Parabola, with Parable acting as a clean, almost meditative intro piece to Parabola, a song which feels like a call to embrace being alive and being in the moment, basically saying that while life is hard and painful, it is also a gift. Meanwhile, the final little guitar line of Parabola, even though it isn't a repeat of Parable, it is a musical phrase that seems to logically build off of and kind of completes what was happening in that piece. Up next is Ticks and Leeches, a song dominated by Danny Carey's drums and Maynard screaming far more than he has on the rest of Lateralus. It's by far the most aggressive song on the album, and one that seems to be pretty clearly written in response to their frustrations with the music industry and their legal wranglings with their label. It is then followed by the title track Lateralus, a song that is famously, at least in certain corners of the internet and among a segment of Tool fans, written according to the Fibonacci sequence. The thing is, though, it kinda happened by accident, as Justin Chancellor, who was credited with bringing in the initial bass riff that acted as the foundation of the song, would state, quote, "It basically wrote itself. The original riff was a bar of 9, a bar of 8, and a bar of 7, and the idea was that it feels like it's folding in on itself." He really had no thought or probably even knowledge of the Fibonacci sequence when he was coming up with this riff. Indeed, it would be drummer Danny Carey who would first make the connection, as he noted that 987 is one of the numbers in the Fibonacci sequence. However, it wouldn't be until Justin Chancellor happened to mention this idea to a firefighter friend of Danny's who was hanging out with them that they really started to learn about the sequence, as it was this firefighter friend who started giving them an education on the Fibonacci sequence, its history, and stuff like how 987 was the 16th number in the sequence, and so on. This was the kind of thing that Adam, Danny, and Justin thought was cool, and so they started playing around with the idea even more. From there, they happened to mention the mathematical concept underlying the song to Maynard, who was also inspired to write the lyrics around a similar idea, with some of the phrases he used containing syllables that line up with the sequence starting from the first number, going up to the 6th, and then going back down again. The opening 4 lines of the song, for example, are black and white are all I see, lines that have 1, 1, 2, and 3 syllables until he reaches 8, which is the 6th number in the sequence, at which point he starts heading back down again. The pre-chorus also notably starts with 13 syllables, the 7th number in the sequence, and then drops down from there. Meanwhile, the specific words are apparently a reference to alchemy and the process of creating the Philosopher's Stone, as the 4 steps involve color changes, blackening, whitening, yellowing, and finally reddening. That all being said, according to Chancellor, they weren't slaves to the sequence, so while there are elements of Fibonacci in the song, it's not exactly correct throughout. It's also a song where Maynard's lyrics influenced a change in the music, as according to Chancellor, quote, "There's a section in the end where he was talking about spirals, so Danny and I started to create the breakdown section where everything was just swimming around on top of each other, and then it all came back together." As for the legend of the so-called Holy Gift, the name given to the myth that the entire album is meant to be rearranged according to the Fibonacci sequence, Justin Chancellor would jokingly not conform nor deny the idea, although he would pretty much indicate that the album as it was released was the way they meant it to be. Basically saying the album they wanted you to hear in the order they wanted you to hear it in is the album that they made and released. He would admit, though, that it is flattering that people are invested enough in their music to try and dig so deep. But in the end, he compares the Holy Gift to the idea of syncing up Dark Side of the Moon to the Wizard of Oz. As he says, you can, quote, "put anything to anything and it works. In other words, just because you find something that happens to fit together does not mean it's purposeful." Adam Jones, meanwhile, would be less coy in his response to the Holy Gift theory, as he stated, quote, "It's just not true. There are elements of that, but not that complex. We have better things to do. But if that's what someone gets out of it and it's positive, then great." Ultimately, though, it's kind of ironic that a song that seems to explicitly argue against overanalyzing stuff has spawned so much speculation and suggestions of deeper and hidden meanings. The album then more or less ends with a trio of tracks: Disposition, Reflection, and Triad. 3 tracks that some Tool fans suspect are all meant to be linked together, as if they are 3 parts of a larger musical piece due to the way they are tied together on the artwork on the back of the CD case. The first of these 3 tracks, Disposition, is a relatively simple, almost meditative piece that almost feels like it's a kind of intro for what is already the longest track on the album, Reflection, which is itself a song that is one of my favorite Tool deep cuts, and one that seems to deal with depression and isolating yourself. Indeed, the protagonist on the song seemingly looks to lock themselves away until they look to the moon and take inspiration from the fact that it doesn't generate its own light but reflects it. With this, we return to the overall theme of healing, as our main character then chooses to let go of their ego and narcissism. As they do so, the song then becomes a call for higher thinking and connectedness. Now, I can't tell if the kind of interconnected nature of these 3 tracks, where they still function as completely independent songs, but in some ways still kind of flow into one another, is on purpose, or is unique to these tracks, or just a general aspect of Lateralus as a whole. Because for me, the thing that I keep coming back to as to why I feel like this work in particular is my favorite Tool album is the feeling that all these songs share a common kind of atmosphere, vibe, whatever you want to call it. Basically, they all sound like they belong together, which is not to say it's the same song over and over again by any means. Each song is unique, yet somehow they all share a same common feeling. Something which I'm not alone in thinking, apparently, as during my research when I learned about David Bottrill and the fact that he was producer for Anima and Lateralus but not for their subsequent releases, I wondered if he did something particularly notable with this album to make it have that consistent mood or feeling. So I specifically began looking into times when he talked about working with Tool, and while I didn't find any indication that he did anything particularly unique for the album, I would find that Bottrill had the same sense that I did when he characterizes Anima as a collection of great songs, but Lateralus is more cohesive, more tied together, and more united in mood. So it doesn't seem like it's anything that he did. It's just that for whatever reason with this album, they crafted something that has this very united feeling. Which would also explain why the Holy Gift idea seems plausible, because these songs just all have this shared vibe to them that allows them to be stuck together like puzzle pieces in multiple different ways and still sound kind of right. Lateralus, in its proper order, would be released on the 15th of May 2001, 5 years after Anima had been released. Before doing so, the members of Tool leaked a list of fake song titles like Mummery, Lactation, and River Christ, which was all one word. something that Adam Jones said they did because round about that time, someone was buying up domain names with titles of albums and song names so they could then sell shirts with those names on them. Knowing this, Tool released the fake album name in the list of fake songs, as the thought of someone selling or even wearing a shirt with River Christ in all one word emblazoned across the front of it was funny to them. Regardless, the actual album Lateralus would hit #1 on the Billboard charts, making it the band's biggest success to that point, despite all its complexities and weirdness. Success which, among other things, saw King Crimson opening for Tool during a portion of their summer tour, which was huge for the entire band, but it was extra special for Adam Jones, as it meant he got to tour with one of his guitar heroes, Robert Fripp. Lateralus for Adam Jones, though, was important for other reasons than its success or the fact that it gave him the chance to tour with one of his musical heroes. For Adam, Lateralus was a crucial crossroads for the band as, quote, "By that time we knew our limits, we knew what stuff we could push, we were a well-oiled machine and we knew each other, and there were things we learned about each other on that record that are pivotal to this day." Lateralus, then, is the album that really defined what Tool would be and sound like going forward. And that, dear listener, is the end of our tale for today. Tool has subsequently released 2 more albums that clearly are the result of the work they put in with Lateralus, both of which are very good albums. Just for whatever reason, for me at least, they don't have quite the same magic as Lateralus, which is why it still remains my favorite. Regardless, Tool has never really had a bad album. Really, the biggest complaint about them is there is such a delay between releases. Everyone, even the members of the band, seem to desire a quicker turnaround on the next, but it's one of those we'll believe it when we see it type of things. As for me, up next I dip my toes back into the realm of historical true crime with Lizzie Borden, and the next Sound Stories will be about a massively popular album that I personally am not extremely familiar with, AC/DC's Back in Black. Until then, though, those are stories for another time. Thank you for listening to Distorted History. If you would like to help out, please rate and review the podcast and tell your friends if you think they'll be interested. If you would like ad-free and early episodes, I've set up such a feed over at patreon.com/distortedhistory. By paying $10 a month, you will gain access to the special ad-free feed available on Spotify or likely through your podcast app as long as it uses an RSS feed. I will continue to post sources on Ko-fi and Twitter, though, as it's just a convenient place to go to access that information. Regardless, once again, thank you for listening, and until next time.